Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to start talking about the specific processes of memory. So in the last few videos, we talked about different types of memory. So now we're going to learn how memory is processed. So remember, it's a three-step process where we start with encoding, we then store the information, and then we can retrieve it. So in this video, we're going to talk about encoding information. So this is essentially where forming the memories and getting memories into the brain. So encoding information has two different processes. So there's effortful processes. So this would be an intentional encoding of information. So this is using a conscious process. So this would be like when you're studying for a class. You're putting in effort to encode information so that you can remember it later. Now, the opposite of that would be automatic processing. So automatic processing is unintentional processing that requires minimal attention. So you don't really need to pay attention to something, but you can still remember it. So for example, if I ask you, what did you do yesterday? You can probably tell me most of what you did. But yesterday, when you were doing all of your activities, you weren't sitting down thinking, okay, I need to remember this. I need to remember exactly what I ate, what I wore, what time did I go to bed, what time did I wake up, all of that stuff. You're just able to remember it kind of automatically. And so that's what automatic processing is. So when we're encoding the information, then we also have different levels of processing. Okay, so whether it's effortful or automatic, there's different levels. So the first level is structural. So this is the structure of something. So is the word capitals? Is it in italics? What are some of the structural properties of the thing you're trying to remember? So again, this could be words. This could be the structure of something if you're looking at it. Like a statue if you were at a museum, or what a certain chair looks like if you're at IKEA. That would be a structural level where you're trying to remember the structural properties. The next one would be phonemic or phonomic. So this is encoding words is intermediate. So it's in between what's the structure and the last one, semantic. So what does it mean? So an example of phonemic would be words that rhyme together. So does the word rhyme with cheer? Or does the word rhyme with yellow? That kind of thing. So it's really listening and trying to remember things based on what it sounds like. Okay, so we kind of mentioned this before when we were talking about the different types of memory and how different memory can be stored in different places based on what it sounds like. Okay. Now, this could also be, again, when you're listening to music. Maybe it sounded poppy or it sounded R&B, something like that. Now, again, the last level of processing here then would be semantic. So this is, what is the meaning, okay? So an example would be, does the word fit in the sentence, he saw the blank, okay? So if you're trying to remember like a word, then semantic here, then we're saying, does the word fit in the sentence? He saw the blank. Well, the blank here needs to be a noun, so like a thing or a person. So if we put in, say, a word like he saw the running, I mean, that just doesn't fit, right? Because that's a verb rather than a noun. So that's where semantics come in, where it's the the value or the meaning behind a word. So with these levels of processing, different levels will show different levels of remembering things. So a deeper processing will facilitate a stronger memory or a stronger recall. So when remembering words, then structural processing is very shallow. It doesn't take a lot of energy. It doesn't do a lot. And then phonemic is a little bit deeper, but semantic is the deepest type or depth of encoding. And so when we then try to recall words, if you're able to put some kind of semantic processing on it, you're a lot more likely to remember that word or that thing because of the semantic processing. And because structural processing is so shallow, while you'll still be able to recall about 40% of the words, you won't be able to remember nearly as much as if you did phonemic or semantic processing. Now, we do have different types of rehearsal we can do. Now, you saw this slide before when we were talking about long-term and short-term memory. And these are different ways to remember things better, right? So these are ways of ensuring that encoding works well. Because remember, encoding is making sure something enters into your long-term memory. And so by using maintenance rehearsal or elaborative rehearsal, we're increasing the probability that something's going to be encoded well. Now, we can also organize information to help with the encoding as well. And so when we organize information, what we're doing is we're arranging the information into a meaningful way. In other words, we're taking information and we're making sure that we're using semantic processing rather than just structural. So there's a lot of different schemes we can do to help this. And these schemes help to serve as a cue when it's time to retrieve information as well. So we oftentimes will call these schemes a mnemonic device. So that's what this word is. It has a silent M. It's weird. But a mnemonic device will help us to recall information later, but also helps us encode information in a meaningful way. So for example here, we've got, in order to remember the order of the planets, instead of just kind of making a list of Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, we can create a mnemonic device that makes something very meaningful. So instead of remembering the order of the planets, we can make a sentence using just the first letter. So instead we've got, my very educated mother just served us noodles. Okay, so now, because you can say the sentence, that you've got the first letter of the order. Now, the only ones you really need to remember which one comes first is mother and my, so that's Mercury and Mars. But in general, this will help you get the majority of them in the correct order. And so that's an example of a mnemonic device. Now, there's a lot of different types of mnemonic devices, and again, these are mental strategies that aid in remembering information. So it helps us encode information, and then it also helps us recall the information. So another example would be the word homes. And this is an anagram. Let's just call it a mnemonic device for remembering the names of the 5 Great Lakes. So we've got Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. Now here, we don't care about the order of things, but we just need to remember what they are. So we've got the word homes made up of the first letter of all the names. Now, again, I mentioned that there's different types of mnemonic devices. So we've got simple, semantic, visual, and complex mnemonic devices. So simple mnemonic devices are, as the word says, they're very simple. They don't take too much work to create. And the main one is chunking. And remember, we talked about chunking before, how it's just grouping things together that mean something. And this is a hierarchical technique. In other words, this is the one that our mind will automatically do. And it's the first type of mnemonic device used. Now, one of the most common ones that you'll have heard about in classes, whether it's a science class or an English class, it's a semantic mnemonic device. And a lot of times it's by using the first letter. So the first letter technique is what we just did with Holmes, right, for the different lakes, or where we made the sentence for the order of the planets. And so that one would be a narrative technique, where we're using the first letter to create a narrative. Another example of a first letter technique, again, you're just using the first letter to create a mnemonic device. And so an example would be the order of the colors in the rainbow would be Roy G. Biv. You've probably heard this before. Again, we do this a lot in childhood when we're trying to learn things. Now, the second one that you can use is a visual-based. So you can use some bizarre imagery or interactive imagery. Now, this might not be the best type of mnemonic device when you're using, trying to remember words, but if you're trying to remember different types of images, that would work, or you can use words to create an image as well, so that you remember things. And then a very complex mnemonic device is called the method of loci. And again, this one's very complicated, so we're not going to talk about some of these specific mnemonic devices, but I just need you to know that there's different types of mnemonic devices, and then know an example of each. So again, we're going to talk about some of these simple mnemonic devices. The first one would be hierarchies. So being able to organize items based on how they're related will help us enhance our memory due to the association. So we're giving items a relationship to one another to help us remember things. So an example would be that your house is in a neighborhood which is in a city. Okay, so a city is bigger than a neighborhood, which is bigger than a house. So we're kind of putting things in order based on size here. Or another example would be when we're talking about the tree of life. Then we've got, all life. We've got the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So we learn the order of things to help us remember them, because using hierarchies can help. Now, again, another example would be chunking, so combining items into a larger unit of meaning. So again, chunking random numbers together to mean a specific phone number, chunking things together, or letters together to mean an actual word, that kind of thing. And so here's a fun little comic kind of showing how when you just mash things together, it looks confusing, but then when you separate them and sometimes you have to reorder things, then it can actually be a meaningful thing. So here's a fun example where the top is just a bunch of letters, but what our brain will do is we'll kind of go through and we'll chunk them together. So now we've got CTV, YMCA, IBM, KGB, and FBI. So when we're just reading this list, it doesn't mean anything to us. But by using chunking, then we're creating smaller, meaningful units that are easier to remember. So with our simple mnemonics, then when you have meaning, information is easier to recall. So if I just gave you a list of letters and you don't use any kind of mnemonic device, then you're not going to be able to recall as many of those numbers or letters in the list. But by chunking things together in a meaningful way, or by being able to do a meaningful hierarchy, then you'll be able to recall significantly more of the words or letters because of that mnemonic device. So that's why we use them. Now, here's just a fun example of a visual-based mnemonic. For this, then we kind of talk about this thing called the dual coding theory, where encoding information uses both verbal and nonverbal. So, for instance, visual things, so like a cigar plus a piano. So, if I give you the word cigar plus piano, maybe you'll imagine this. So this would be non-interacting, a non-bizarre visual-based. So you've got a piano and a cigar, very separate. Now, a non-interacting bizarre visual would be like the bottom of a piano, which is just confusing, and a cigar falling from the ground, smoking from both ends. That's not how they work, so that's pretty bizarre, but again, they're two separate things. Usually things that will help encode information is when your two things are interacting. So an interacting non-bizarre situation would be a cigar on a piano. So by creating this image, then you're better able to remember the two words because they're interacting together. You're creating a scene in your mind. And then interacting bizarre would be that somehow the cigar got under the piano keys. I don't know how that works. But again, you can see how you're creating some sort of narrative. You're creating a scene in your mind that's going to help you remember it in the future. So now some semantic mnemonics would be, again, we're using semantics, so we're using word meaning to help remember things. And so the first one, of course, is the first letter technique. So we talked about Roy G. Biv. And then the narrative technique, which tells a story. And then the final one is the complex mnemonics. And so an example would be the method of loci. So this is a link where you link what you need to remember with a place that you know well, whether it's real or not. So for example, your house. So you remember your grocery list by mentally walking through your house room by room. Or for me, what I do when I make my grocery list is I mentally walk through the grocery store so that I can put things down in the order that I'll meet them at the grocery store. If you guys ever watched the TV show Sherlock, then you know he has like that mind palace, so that would be the method of loci, where you remember things based on where they are in your mental palace. Or you can remember things where they actually are. So, where did I meet this person? Where did I meet that person? And you can remember people's names based on where you met them. So that's an example of a complex mnemonic.